Well, thank you very much, Arnold. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I should tell you that one of those continents that I've taught on, and I've done so on a regular basis, is Asia. And I have regularly taught a class there in the Philippines at IAS. So you are in a familiar part of the world to me. I wish I was there with you in person. At the moment, in fact, I also grew up in Malaysia. We lived in Thailand while I was quite young, and I went to school in Singapore as well. So Southeast Asia, that's where I grew up, and it's a part of the world that I love. I still think of it as home. Well, I am going to share my screen with you, and we are going to launch into a presentation that I have put together, and we will go from there. I apologize that you're going to have to see my entire screen there for just a moment, but this is the slide that I want to start with, because I'm hoping that most of you are well aware that not this previous Sabbath, but the Sabbath before was Creation Sabbath. This is that specially designated Sabbath to remember that God is our creator and our redeemer. And you can see here various places, churches or schools and so on, that have registered that they're having events. It's always thrilling for me to see all of these institutions showing up in the Philippines that go to our website, which is creationsabbath.net, and let us know that they're doing something for Creation Sabbath. As I tell people, the week after Creation Sabbath, it's not too late to start planning for next year. But it's the whole point of Creation Sabbath is to joyfully worship our Creator and Redeemer. So if anybody is intimidated by this topic or anything, you've got it wrong. And we're going to go through some interesting things about creation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the kind of research that I'm doing right now, which I think may interest you. But I also want to draw your attention to a very interesting paper that came out recently. And this all does work together. Before we do that, let's think about what the Bible tells us about the creation and the God that whom we worship. This is the Apostle Paul writing to the Christians in Rome. And he said, "For since the creation of the world, this is God's, invisible attributes are clearly seen." That seems like it's a little bit backwards, doesn't it? How can something be invisible and yet clearly seen? But we'll see here what he's talking about. Being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So think about somebody whom you admire, let's say somebody who's very artistic. When you look at their art, the thing that they have created, it tells you something about them, something about the brilliance in their mind, something about the skill that they have in working with the paint or or whatever it is. I mean, maybe they're a sculptor and they're working with wood, or they're working with some kind of stone, or maybe they make other kinds of things. But that creativity, that skill, their abilities are evident in what they've made. So even if you're not looking at the person directly, from what they've made, you can know certain things about them. Obviously not everything. So there's a very good reason why God gave us 2 books, not just one. He gave us his word, the Bible, and he gave us his works. And viewed through the worldview that the Bible opens up to us, viewed with a knowledge of the Creator whom it introduces to us, all sorts of interesting things come out of this creation that we're part of. I want to talk also a little bit about Charles Darwin, and that may seem like an unusual choice of topics for a talk about creation, but you'll see where I'm going here in just a moment. You'll remember that Charles Darwin went on a voyage around the world as a young man, a voyage on a boat called the Beagle. And they started out, well, there's the equator there. They started out in England. They went to South America, and they went down the coast of South America. They visited the Falkland Islands. They went up the west coast of South America, so up the coast of Chile and so on, and then out to the Galapagos Islands. And this is what I'm going to focus on a little bit in this presentation. These islands are a little bit like the Philippines. They're an archipelago. And then, of course, they eventually went back to the United Kingdom on this boat. And he wrote a book about what he had found there. In that book, called The Voyage of the Beagle, he wrote, "The object of the expedition was to complete the survey of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, to survey the shores of Chile, Peru, and some other places, Pacific." I'm afraid I can't see my entire quotation here. It's covered up by something. But to visit certain islands, I believe it is in the Pacific, and to carry a chain of chronometrical measurements around the world. You'll remember that with navigation back then, they had difficulties. They could tell their latitude, but not their longitude. So it was the English, the British, who figured out how to measure that latitude. And that involved the creation of clocks that could measure time, these chronometers that could measure time very accurately. And by using those, they could tell exactly where they were on the surface of the earth. That's why the English became masters of the oceans. There were obviously many other powers involved in navigating around. Spain, obviously, had found and influenced the Philippines very much. But it was the English who were sort of very obsessed with knowing exactly where they were. And so the Voyage of the Beagle had to do with that. It also had to do with looking at what was there. What sorts of resources were there in different parts of the world? What kinds of people? Could they trade with them? Could they take those resources and use them in industry or in some other trading endeavor? So he was sort of part of that big picture of things. And he wrote in his book, The Origin of Species, this about the Galapagos Islands. "The Galapagos archipelago, situated under the equator, lies at a distance between 500 and 600 miles from the shores of South America. Here, almost every product of the land and of the water bears the unmistakable stamp of the American continent." And this is really an argument that he was using for his theory of evolution. He said, if you look at these organisms, they look like those that are found in South America, but they're different. So therefore, they must have come from South America and then changed in some way. And he proposed this mechanism of change called natural selection. Of course, there's a flip side to this argument, and that is that if these organisms were actually changing in the way that he extrapolated they were changing, then they would be far more different than what you find there. In other words, you wouldn't be able to recognize the birds as being birds that came from South America just as you can recognize the birds in the Philippines as those that came from Asia, for example. Those birds, they didn't evolve into something completely different from birds. They're ever so slightly different birds. And as a consequence of that, we can see that they are South American birds, in fact. So you could argue that what the organisms in the Galapagos Islands and on other remote islands, what they show is that God created organisms highly adaptable, so they can quickly adapt to changing situations in their environment, but they cannot adapt forever. And so they remain that basic kind of organism. Well, when you go to the Galapagos Islands, you find lots of references to Charles Darwin and his visit there. There are lots of statues of him. This one here, he looks kind of august. This one, I don't know. I think they were probably trying to honor him, but I'm not sure how successful they really were. Here's another one. This one, he looks like kind of, I don't know, jolly Santa Claus or something. And perched on his head is one of the Galapagos mockingbirds. These were one of the animals that he made a very big deal about because they obviously came from South America. And that then shows you the crux of this argument that he was presenting. Look, they've changed a little bit here in the Galapagos Islands, but they're also still the same. They don't adapt forever. Which was the claim that he made. If you go to the Galapagos Islands and you visit the main town there, Porto Aurora, there's this road there that goes down to the Charles Darwin Research Center. And so to get there, you pass this building. This is the Origins Museum of Nature. And this is something that was recently set up by the South American Division. I'm really excited about it. They also have a church there and a school, a very active campus. And in that Origins Museum of Nature, what they offer is a museum that anybody can come in and visit. I was there a couple of months ago, and it's very impressive. People just come in. They're looking for something to do in the Galapagos Islands, and this gives us an opportunity to present a different view to visitors and also to local people there of the way nature works and the God who created all things. A very different view than that evolutionary view that Charles Darwin presented. Here I am with Dr. Mara Brandeo. She runs this center at the moment, and a very, very impressive woman. She's certainly a lot better at languages than I am. She speaks Portuguese, Spanish, and English all very well. And so that makes her a very good person there to be greeting people and sharing the biblical worldview with visitors. Here are some of the research group whom I work with there from Loma Linda University. And this is going onto an island there called South Plaza. You can see it's very beautiful, a very beautiful place indeed. Here we are working on one of the marine iguanas there. It's a lot of work. It looks like we're all just standing around, doesn't it? These marine iguanas are quite incredible creatures. Charles Darwin noticed them when he was there. He wrote this: "The black lava rocks on the beach are frequented by large, most disgusting, clumsy lizards." He didn't like them, but these are the organisms that I'm studying at the moment. They look kind of like dragons, don't they? And they are quite unique. There are two organisms in the world that are land-dwelling vertebrates, but they live primarily on eating seaweed. One of them is a specific breed of sheep in Scotland, on one Scottish island, and these marine iguanas. They are quite remarkable creatures. I think they're quite beautiful. When you work with them and you hold them, they you can see that there's intelligence in their eyes. It's quite incredible. We tend to forget how amazing other organisms are. Look at this creature. He almost looks like he's smiling. And here's another remarkable thing about them. They have an eye on the top of their head, an extra eye. There are other reptiles that have this feature, not 100% of them, but that structure that you see there in the middle of the head, the sort of white structure, that is an extra eye. It seems to see things in a different way than its regular eyes, but it certainly detects light and dark and does all sorts of things. They're a bit of a mystery, an amazing and fun mystery. Well, these creatures, they are plentiful in many areas, and they're not particularly concerned about human beings. So you can be walking down the sidewalk there and find them just splayed out on the sidewalk. Here's another kind of iguana that you find there. These are land iguanas, and you can see they're quite different. They're differently colored. Their bodies are quite a different shape, and they have a different diet as well. Charles Darwin wrote about these. He said, "We have another large reptile in great numbers. It's a great lizard, in structure closely allied to those imps of darkness." So he's calling the marine iguanas little devils, imps of darkness here, which frequent the seashore. They have a ridge and spines along the back, are colored an orange yellow, with the hinder part of back brick red. So he was actually talking about a slightly different species on a different island here. This one here obviously isn't red in its hind regions. They're hideous animals, but are considered good food. This day 40 were collected. I want you to think about his attitude towards these creatures. Some people believe a myth that Charles Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands with, as a young Christian man, and that he was compelled by the evidence that he saw there to abandon his belief in God and become a materialist. That's not true. We now anybody can have access to his notebooks and things, and we can see that he was a fairly committed materialist from the time he kind of dropped out of medical school when he was going to the University of Edinburgh, or the medical school in Edinburgh. That kind of interests me because my father didn't drop out there. He was a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh. And but anyway, the medicine wasn't for Charles Darwin, and that's why he went down to Cambridge University to study, of all things, theology. But before he even went down there, he was a committed materialist. That's indisputable at this particular point. So when, as a young man, he went on the Beagle and they sailed around the world, that materialistic view was how he was looking at things. And as a consequence of that, he was not seeing the beauty and the interest that these organisms represent. However, I'd add one other thing. While he would have argued that these iguanas are obvious and dramatic examples of evolution, in reality, they are not. They are actually beautiful examples of adaptation. They are obviously iguanas. Iguanas are a common kind of lizard that just somehow seems to get from island to island. That's why you find many of them in the Caribbean, for example. They just seem to have an ability to do it. I don't know how they got out there to the Galapagos Islands, but it turns out that these land iguanas in the wild will occasionally interbreed with the marine iguanas. So they are the same, they remain the same kind of organism, and they produce offspring when they interbreed. They have significant differences between them. That shows, in my view, how rapidly And elegantly, organisms have been equipped to adapt to these new environments that they find themselves in. It's actually a beautiful example of design. Here I am with some of them. Um, Out there, you can get big ones and small ones. There were some reasonably sized ones out here. And when you handle them, yeah, sometimes there's blood. They're actually quite passive, this particular species of iguana, but they're quite powerful creatures. And if they get you with the claws on their back legs or something, or if they bite you, it can be, not a super serious injury, although one guy whom I was not working with, did manage to get a finger bitten off by one of these iguanas. So you do need to be careful, and it's smart to wear gloves. Here you can see why they're called marine iguanas, because they swim in the ocean. As they go out every day and they dive down and they eat seaweed. It's amazing. And there are lots of other organisms there, these white-tipped sharks. So for some reason or other, they like to come in and just rest in this particular area. Amazing. Kind of fun stuff. This is Dr. Brandeo, and she was swimming out there. I don't think she was aware that she was swimming with the marine iguanas, but I quickly got this picture of her when she was doing that. So Sir Isaac Newton asked a question about the bodies of animals, like marine iguanas or human beings or any other creature. He said, how came the bodies of animals to be contrived with so much art? And for what ends were there several parts? Was the eye contrived without skill in optics, and the ear without knowledge of sounds? And these are questions that all worldviews actually seek to provide answers with. The answer that evolutionary materialistic worldview that Charles Darwin championed, that particular worldview answers these questions with yes. The nature had no skill in optics, but natural selection just somehow or other caused eyes to come to be, and ears, and so on. I want to draw your attention to a paper that was published in April of this year. And it's a very technical paper. Those of you who are interested, I give the URL there, and you can go and look it up yourselves if you're kind of science oriented. But I'm going to explain to you what this paper is talking about, because it relates to this issue of what is a reasonable cause for what we observe in ourselves and in marine iguanas and in all other vertebrates. And to illustrate this Darwinian worldview, I'm going to use a couple of quotations from somebody named Richard Dawkins, Clinton Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins was a very famous evangelist for atheism and a huge supporter of Darwinism. He wrote in a book called The Blind Watchmaker, "Suppose I tell you that the eye's photocells are pointing backwards, away from the scene being looked at." So these are the light-sensitive cells at the back of the eye in the retina. And the wires connecting the photocells to the brain run over the surface of the retina. So he's talking here about the nerves running over the surface. So the light rays have to pass through a carpet of massed wires before they hit the photocells. That doesn't make sense, and it gets even worse. So let's look at what he's talking about here. Here's a human eye, or it could be an elephant's eye, or it could be a bird's eye. All vertebrates have the same basic design for their eye. So here are the light-sensitive cells in our retina. And if you look at somebody's face, light reflected from that face is focused by the lens in your eye onto these light-sensitive cells. They react to that light and they send a signal to the nerves. And here is the problem as Richard Dawkins sees it. Those nerves run in front of the light-sensitive cells, and then they have to go through the light-sensitive cells to take the signal back to your brain. Let's zoom in on just a little bit of the retina here and take a look at how things are arranged. So here are these light-detecting cells, and the problem is that they are very metabolically active. That means that they use a lot of energy. So you just sitting here looking at this presentation, if you're not exercising or anything else, I've seen estimates as high as a quarter of the energy that you're using in your body right now would be just your eyes. It's a lot of energy that's being used. And that energy comes from sugar that is oxidized with oxygen. So where do we get sugar and oxygen from? That's delivered to the eyes through the blood. So I don't know if you've ever tried this. I don't necessarily recommend it. I have when I've injured myself. But if you've ever tried looking through blood, you've probably noticed it's pretty opaque. Therefore, it's absolutely necessary that that blood go behind the light-sensitive cells. That means there is actually only one place where the nerves can go, and that's in front of them. And this is the design that Richard Dawkins is criticizing, but you'll notice that he doesn't suggest a better design, because this is the way at least our kind of eye needs to be designed. This is why we have such fantastic eyes. There are other retina designs that you see in some invertebrates. They are well suited to the needs of those organisms. But for vertebrates, like human beings, this design is pretty much the only way to go, even though Richard Dawkins doesn't like it. So what's the problem with this as he sees it? When light comes in, it gets dissipated as it goes through the nerve cells, and he figures that, somebody like God should have been able to come up with a better design than that. He's not satisfied with it. He goes on and he says this: one consequence of the photocells pointing backwards is that the wires that carry their data somehow have to pass through the retina and back to the brain. What they do in the vertebrate eye is all converge on a particular hole in the retina where they dive through it. The hole filled with nerves is called the blind spot. It's not just bad design, it's the design of a complete idiot. So I've already shown you why the design is this way, but why is Richard Dawkins so dismissive, so negative about it? It's because he believes that his whole body and everything else is the result of a process that had no intelligence involved in it at all. It had an IQ of 0. That's what he believes. And as a consequence of that, he interprets everything he sees within that framework, which must be pretty awful for a biologist. But anyway, let's look at what he's talking about here. There's that optic nerve, and there's that blind spot. Why is this allowed to be? Well, it's the only way it can be. But you know what? When an engineer is doing things, they recognize issues like this, and they generally come up with a solution. Intelligent engineers do this. It turns out that your right and your left eye, they are both they both have blind spots, but they're in different locations. And as a consequence of that, what you're seeing with your right eye is used to fill in the blind spot in your left eye, and vice versa. And as a consequence of that, we actually have nearly perfect 180 degree vision in front of us. There are no gaps in our vision. Our brain is putting it all together, so we're not even aware that we have a blind spot. So here's the human retina. And what about that problem that Dawkins doesn't like with the nerve cells dissipating the light that passes through them? Actually, there is an engineered solution to that as well, and this was fairly recently discovered. There's a whole class of cells called glial cells that are associated normally with nerves. And it turns out that in the retina, there are these specialized glial cells that go through that maze of nerves, and they act like fiber optics. They're very transparent. And as a consequence of that, the light that hits the surface of the retina, where all those nerves are, is transmitted through by these glial cells. It's pretty amazing stuff. Absolutely incredible. And when you think about it, as you watch this presentation, your eyes are doing this continually. It's just all the time. This is what's happening. It's no wonder that a fair amount of energy is used, by the way, in doing this. I don't know, when I look at this, I see extraordinarily good design. But there's another thing, another problem that Dawkins and others have had with the arrangement of things in the eye that they see as bad design, therefore evidence that God had nothing to do with it. And you'll actually probably have already thought of this, but just because something's badly designed does not mean that it wasn't designed at all. So that's a whole other logical fallacy in all of this. But it turns out that God is actually, he declared his creation very good, and he had good reason to do that. Let's zoom in on some of these light-sensitive cells. There are several different kinds of light-sensitive cell, but one of them is called a cone cell. And that one I want to take a look at because that's the subject of that paper that I told you about there a few slides ago. Up here at the top of these light-sensitive cells, you have the interface with the neurons, the nerves. So this is where the signal is being sent to those nerves that take it back to your brain. Here in the middle is the part of the cell where you have all of the normal cell activities going on. This is where the energy is being generated with the sugar and oxygen and other things. And down here at the bottom in these outer segments, that's where there are pigments that actually absorb the light and generate that signal. So there are a lot of mitochondria in there. Those mitochondria are important because they're what generate the energy inside cells. So the light comes in and the signal goes back. And we want to look at just one question here. How is light efficiently transmitted to the light-absorbing pigments at the back of cone cells? How does that happen? Because, again, some people would say this is a backwards design. And it turns out this paper published this year helps us understand how this actually works. Remember, there are all of these mitochondria there, and what we would expect is that as light comes in, it starts trying to go through the cell body, it'll be reflected and refracted off all of those organelles in there, and it'll go scattering off all over the place in the eye, which would be a very bad thing. You wouldn't be able to see sharp images at all. So there must be a solution because we see very clearly, most of us. And that solution is actually in these mitochondria. The mitochondria are arranged into a specialized structure that acts like a micro lens, a microscopic lens in there. And this is how things work. As light comes in, yes, it begins to spread out in the cell body, but it is taken by this tiny, tiny, tiny lens formed by the mitochondria and bent back in and focused down into the outer segment where there are these pigments that are absorbing that light. And then there's an amazing chain of biochemical events that result in a signal being sent back up. But can you see how amazing this is? This creates a system that is so efficient that it is utilizing more than 90% of the light that hits your eye. It's unmatched by anything that humans have ever made. It's absolutely jaw-dropping. And it contains, where Darwinists saw nothing but bad design and stopped looking, unfortunately, because of that, what it actually has is multiple examples of beautiful, elegant design that testify to the power and wisdom, I would say also, of our Creator, just as the Apostle Paul says. And yet, in the face of this, people are blinded to the evidence that's right in front of them. Here is another quotation from this year by somebody saying, "Consider eyes, organs so complex they fool some into thinking they must have been designed by a creator." When you look at statements like this, it's reasonable to ask who the fool is. Now, I don't like to mock other people. I don't think that's necessary. But really, who is the fool? When you've got evidence like what we see in the eye right in front of us. Let's talk about some implications of this. This is not the first and will probably not be the last case where proofs of Darwinism become progressively less compelling as new data accrue. I've actually already seen this happen multiple times in my life. These unanswerable arguments by Darwinists just sort of fall into pieces. And so it's a great time to be alive and to be a biologist and a believer in the Creator God. Because Darwinism is as much a religion as Catholicism, Hinduism, or animism, believers will commonly simply continue to interpret the evidence within their old worldview, perhaps not even seeing how clearly misplaced their beliefs actually are. This certainly doesn't mean that anyone has all the answers, especially not Christians. Everyone lives by faith. Everyone. Okay? Scientists live by faith too. Just like, I don't know, nuns live by faith or we live by faith. But the faith of Christians does seem to have been richly rewarded. So yes, when I started out as a biologist, I didn't have great answers to everything that Richard Dawkins was saying. However, I'm glad that I lived by faith for a little while. Now, this seems like a random thing that I'm showing you here, but it does have to do with my trip to the Galapagos Islands a couple of months ago. I was walking through the airport, and what I saw was something I wasn't expecting. And that's one of these shops there with, I don't know whether you can see what these books are that are being sold in front of this store. Choice books indeed. They're Bibles and Bible books for children and so on. Somebody made this happen, and I'm really impressed by it. I wish it was me. What a great way of sharing our faith. Why doesn't every bookstore in every airport have Bible books for sale like this? This is a place where people still buy books to read on the plane. They're looking for things for their children to do on the plane. Wow, What absolute genius. I see this as being like that Origins Museum of Nature that we've built and developed there and continue to develop in the in the Galapagos Islands. Not only is it a witness to the public, it also serves as a base for us to do research on things. So it's a very powerful thing. But so is this. This is incredible. So back to the Galapagos Islands. Once I got there, there are so many beautiful things that I see there. So many beautiful things. I love the fact that the animals are not afraid of human beings. This particular sea lion, I was working all around him. He didn't mind at all. He was up there on his throne while the waters raged below him, and I worked around him, and he was just as happy and content as could be. Yes, I was there. It was wonderful. I could have walked up to him and given him a pat like a dog if I wanted to. That's illegal to do, and he might not have enjoyed that so much. I might have gotten a nip out of it. I don't know. But it was still wonderful. To me, being there in the Galapagos Islands it's like a foretaste of heaven. And yet this is what Charles Darwin wrote. He said the country was compared to what we might imagine the cultivated parts of the infernal regions to be. He was saying, these islands, they're like hell. How awful to live your life seeing the world like that. But he writes about this also in his autobiography at the end of his life. He'd lost the ability to see beauty and to get joy out of beautiful things, including nature itself. How sad. But that's what that worldview does. This is why we as Christians are called to share a different worldview. Yeah, in the town of Porto Ayora, these sea lions, they're lying around everywhere. I think of them as, well, I mean, they're just everywhere. It's wonderful. Yes, I was tempted to join them myself. They do a lot of sleeping. Anyway, this particular one caught my attention. Look at him. This is at a hotel there, and he was lying there on one of the chaise lounges. After a while, he got up and took a swim around their swimming pool. Then he got out, and this was truly amazing. There was a lady sitting. In fact, it's the lady that you see there behind on the other chaise lounge. She was sitting on this one that you see the sea lion on right now. And he came up to her. He wanted that one, and he actually pushed her off it. Just an amazing thing. It was, I don't know, she didn't mind moving to another one, but he wanted that one. But how nice to be able to interact with these wild animals in that way. That is what heaven's going to be like for me. This is years ago when I was in the Galapagos Islands on another trip. And this juvenile sea lion, he was looking at me, and then he came over, and look at this. He smelt my leg like a dog might. What an amazing thing. What an incredible experience that was. Every day in heaven's going to be like that for me. And by the way, I was thrilled to see earlier that that you used Ecclesiastes 3:11. I like the hint in there that we're never going to know the end from the beginning. When we go to heaven, it's not like we're going to know everything. Our God is infinite. He created a universe that has infinite, endlessly interesting things to discover in it. And each one of those things is a thrilling revelation of something about him. Oh, look at this. Where else in the world can you just walk up to these creatures with their babies like this? I don't know whether you can see in this picture, this mother and her baby beside her, just to the left there. I was there when she gave birth. It was beautiful. It was a miracle. It was gorgeous. Charles Darwin, all he saw was struggle and death in the world and suffering. And yes, those things exist. But God created something very good. He made everything beautiful in its time. Yes, it's marred by sin, but the beauty that's there to discover, the beauty that we can see as long as we're not blinded by our worldview to seeing that beauty. This is what God says. Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread forth the earth and that which comes from it, who gives breath to the people on it and spirit to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you. That's you, that's me. Called you in righteousness and will hold your hand. So he's with us. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the Gentiles, to open blind eyes. These philosophies that are out there, these religions out there that blind people to seeing the beauty in the world, that blind them to the wonderful creator and redeemer whom we worship. God is going to be with us as we seek to share a knowledge of him with the world. And by doing that, yes, we'll bring them out of, we're releasing prisoners from prison. And we're releasing those who sit in darkness from the prison house. What a wonderful mission we Christians have in life. So I want to remind you that next year, Creation Sabbath will be on October 22. That's a very difficult day, or at least date, for Adventists to forget. I hope that the churches that you're involved with will plan something wonderful for Creation Sabbath. I hope that it will not be just something for you, but that you'll do something that you can share with your entire community, because that is what God has called us to do. That's what our Creator gives us the power to do in the communities around us. If you're looking for other resources in this area, I would suggest these two websites, grista.org, that is the URL for the Geoscience Research Institute, where I work, and also the John1010project.com. The John 1010 Project is a project that I've been working with other Christians, not just Adventists.